Bartimaeus and Zacchaeus in Jericho. Late in the afternoon of Thursday, March 30th, Jesus, followed by a group of about 200 believers, approached the city of Jericho. At the city gate sat beggars, among whom was a certain Bartimaeus, an older man who had been blind since his youth. This blind beggar had heard much about Jesus and was well aware of the healing of a blind man in Jerusalem after he had washed the clay from his eyes. On Jesus' last visit to Jericho, he had only heard about it after Jesus had already left. Bartimaeus was determined that this would not happen again, so when he learned that Jesus was visiting Jericho, he decided to actively call out to him. The news that Jesus was approaching had already spread throughout Jericho, and hundreds of residents were waiting for him. When Bartimaeus heard that Jesus was near, he raised his voice and began to shout loudly, "Jesus, Jesus, have mercy on me." And since he kept shouting louder, some of those close to Jesus went to him, rebuked him, and asked him to be quiet. But this had the opposite effect, and he shouted even louder. When Jesus heard the blind man calling out, he stopped. And when he saw him, he said to his friends, "Bring the man to me." The apostles helped Bartimaeus to his feet and said to him, "Come, for the Master is calling you." When Bartimaeus heard these words, he threw off his cloak and jumped forward into the middle of the road, and those standing nearby led him to Jesus. Jesus said to Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man answered, "I want to see again." When Jesus heard this request and saw his faith, he said, "You will regain your sight. Go on your way. Your faith has healed you." Immediately he could see, and he stayed with Jesus, praising God. The next day, when Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, Bartimaeus walked ahead of the travelers, telling everyone how he had regained his sight in Jericho. When Jesus entered Jericho, the sun was nearly setting, and he planned to stay within the city walls for the night. Now there lived in Jericho a certain Zacchaeus. This man was a tax collector whose job was to collect taxes for the Roman authorities. Zacchaeus worked on a commission basis and had become a wealthy man. He had heard much about Jesus and was curious about what kind of man he was. When he learned that Jesus was within the city walls again, he tried to push through the crowd, but it was too dense, and because he was short in stature, he couldn't see over the heads. Realizing he couldn't push through the crowd, he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree, whose broad branches hung over the road. He knew that this way he would have a good view of Jesus as he passed by. But when Jesus passed, he stopped, looked up and said, "Come down, Zacchaeus, for tonight I must stay at your house." When Zacchaeus heard these astonishing words, he nearly fell out of the tree. He went to Jesus and expressed his great joy that the Master was willing to stay in his house. They immediately went to Zacchaeus' house, and the residents of Jericho were very surprised that Jesus would stay with a tax collector. When Jesus stood at the door of Zacchaeus' house, one of the onlookers, a Pharisee from Jericho, exclaimed, "See, this man is going to stay with a sinner, an apostate son of Abraham, a thief who robs his own people." When Jesus heard these words, he looked down at Zacchaeus and smiled. Then Zacchaeus stood on a bench and called out loudly so everyone could hear him, "People of Jericho, listen to me. I may be a tax collector and a sinner, but the great teacher has come to stay in my house. And before he enters, I want to tell you that I will give half of all my goods to the poor, and from tomorrow on, if I have wronged anyone, I will repay them 4 times over. I wholeheartedly seek salvation and will learn to do justice in God's eyes." When Zacchaeus finished speaking, Jesus said, "Today, salvation has come to this house, and you have indeed become a son of Abraham." Then Jesus turned to the onlookers and said, "Do not be surprised by what I say, and do not be offended by what we do. For I have always said that the Son of Man has come to seek and save what was lost." They stayed that night at Zacchaeus' house. The next morning they rose and took the robbers' road. which led up to Bethany.